Junjie, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, let's start. Hello, good morning and good afternoon and good evening. This is Paul Liu from NC State. Welcome again to the World River and the Delta System Source to Sink webinar series. This talk series is co-sponsored by NSF, NC State University, Louisiana State University, East China Normal University in Shanghai, Utrecht, and CSDMS. Today is we are very delighted to invite Dr. Junjie Wang from the Department of Earth Science at Utrecht University. She will talk about spatially explicit nitrogen and phosphorus imports to the Chinese Sea, the marginal sea, and the implication for coastal ecosystem. Before I introduce Junjie, and as always, we said all our previous talk, including this one, is archived on our YouTube channel or the Chinese Bilibili station. So feel free to use them for research and education. At the same time, we also maintain the Source to Sink Twitter account. As you can see, we announced every week's talk and some news, conference, or publications. Please feel free, go ahead to follow us on Twitter. And next Wednesday, same time, we have Professor Binai Shuang from Ocean University of China come here talk about the Yellow River, how the geomorphological response to the dam regulation. So please mark your calendar. So as I mentioned, Junjie is from Utrecht University. Currently, she is a postdoc fellow research over there. Originally, Junjie graduate from Nanjing University, undergraduate student, also master in the physical geography, then PhD in the marine chemistry from Ocean University of China. Her research focused on trying to understand and develop models, quantify the transport of nutrients and the related elements to the coastal, from the inland water to the coastal system. So today, I think Junjie will bring us some very interesting talk, particularly in the model, try to give us the full picture, a good understanding about the nitrogen and phosphate import. Hey, Junjie, go ahead to share screen.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Junjie Wang. I'm a postdoc in Utrecht University, and thank Paul very much for introducing me. And I'm very happy to be here to present my research about nitrogen and phosphorus inputs to Chinese seas and their implications for coastal ecosystem over the past several decades. As we all know, China has the largest population in the world, and the population has been increasing very rapidly since the 1960s. And in order to feed this large population, we need more food. So the food production in China has been rapidly increasing since the 1960s, especially after 1990s. The production of crops, livestock, and aquaculture have been more rapidly increasing. And this increasing food productions means growing nutrient use during agricultural activities, for example, and aquaculture productions, and for example, the fertilization activities. And this growing nutrient use almost mean the excessive nutrients left in the systems, which means actually part of the nutrients are not fully used. They go into the aquatic systems of very different sources, and this nutrient in the aquatic system are transported from upstream to downstream along the river continuum, and finally goes through the estuary to the coastal ecosystems. So with this increasing nutrient inputs from human activities, we already observed increasing nutrient contents in Chinese major rivers. For example, the three major rivers, the Yellow River in the northern part of China, the Yangtze River, also called Changjiang River, in the central part of China, also the Pearl River in the southern part of China. And historical observations based studies show that the concentration of nutrients like dissolved inorganic nitrogen have been rapidly increasing during the past few decades, especially after 1980s, and in the nutrient flux as well. And with this increasing nutrient contents in rivers, eutrophication problems in Chinese seas are also frequently reported. For example, in the Yellow Sea, the concentration of dissolved inorganic nitrogen and dissolved inorganic phosphorus have been reported increasing since the 1980s. And with this increasing nutrient concentrations in sea waters, eutrophication problems are almost reported every year during the past few decades in Chinese coastal waters, especially in the estuarine areas of some large rivers, like the Yangtze River, which is very obvious reddish in the figures. And these eutrophication problems also cause negative ecological impacts, like the occurrence of harmful algal blooms. And we can tell that from 1990s, and the red tide area has been largely expanded, and also the total red tide area and frequency every year in Chinese total coastal area have been largely increasing since 1970s and maintained relatively high levels after 2000. And in the Yellow Sea, which is a marginal sea of China, the world's largest green tide have been reported since 2007 as their first appearance, and the overall cover area of this largest green tide have been increasing as well. The following three photos shows the actual situations when the harmful algal blooms break out, which follows the order of green tide, brown tide, and red tide, which is really serious problems in Chinese coastal waters. In order to solve these problems, we need actually a complete picture of nutrient inputs, which is currently lacking. We want to know how much are the nitrogen and phosphorus inputs to the Chinese seas, how did they change with natural and anthropogenic changes in the rapidly developing countries, and what are their implications for the coastal ecosystems. And more specifically, we want to know how much are the sources, are the inputs from individual sources so that we can solve that. We focus on the research area of Chinese seas under the definition of large marine ecosystem, which we call LME for short. Our three LME, Yellow Sea, East China Sea, and South China Sea LME are shown in these figures below. And the Yellow Sea LME is composed of Yellow Sea and Bohai Sea marginal seas. And the other two large marine ecosystems are almost the same as the definition of marginal seas. And among them, Bohai Sea is a continental sea bordered only by China. But the other three marginal seas are bordered not only by China, but also by some other countries. As is shown in the left figure, the grayish areas from the northern North Korea to the southern Indonesia. So when we calculate the nutrient inputs to the seas, we need to not only consider nutrient inputs from Chinese mainland, we also need to consider nutrients from other countries, river basins, land areas, and so on. So what kind of research approach are we going to use? We decide to use a model to address the nutrient inputs, which we consider total inputs is composed of the river export to the seas, the submarine fresh groundwater discharge to the seas, the atmospheric deposition over the sea area and the nutrient release from mariculture activities in the coastal waters. Why we use model? Because historical observations for inputs from all these sources during the past few decades are actually lacking. Even for some river observations, which we usually think are actually more sufficient than other sources, measurements are only done for a few major rivers. Besides that, we also want to know not only the total number of the nutrient inputs, we also want to know the spatial distribution and their temporal changes. And we also want to know how the human activity change the nutrient sources to the seas. So we decided to use a model approach, and this model approach should be able to track the spatial changes in a spatially explicit way so that we can solve the research questions we just proposed. Our model scheme is composed of a series of coupling models with a spatial resolution of half a degree and a time step of 1 year. Firstly, to resolve the river export, we need to know how the river works, which calls for the hydrologic model of a PCR globe, which is a global hydrology model that help us to quantify the water stores and flux, volume, surface area, depth, and travel time of the river basins. And we need to know the nutrient inputs to the river basins. And so we need integrated assessment model, which is called IMAGE, that links human activities that use agriculture activities to various nutrient inputs to the surface water and groundwaters. And to resolve the nutrient transport and processing, the model, our model called IMAGE GM, which is short for the integrated modeling to assess global environment, global nutrient model, coupling the hydrology model for PCR globe and the integrated assessment model of the IMAGE, so that the nutrient transport from the upstream cell to the downstream until their export from the estuary area are simulated. And for the nutrient release from mariculture, we have a branch model of IMAGE GM that simulates the nutrient budget from aquaculture activities based on the real aquaculture production of each cultured species. And for the nutrient release, for the nutrient from atmospheric deposition over the sea areas, we coupled another model called TM-FAST for nitrogen and the CEM4 for phosphorus. So now we now goes for the model to quantify river export and submarine fresh groundwater discharge. We use the IMAGE, which we just introduced, that couple the hydrology and the nutrient delivery, and use a spiraling method to address the in-stream retention. So with this method, it first quantify the nutrient in this cell from various human and natural inputs like the agricultural and the natural system, and from this kind of land use type, their nutrient budget into the soil, and their transport finally to the surface water via different pathways like surface runoff and shallow and deep groundwater pathways. And there are also other direct sources to the surface waters like the wastewater discharge from human and the freshwater aquaculture and atmospheric deposition directly over the surface water. And with this, we are going to introduce further about this nutrient release from freshwater and mariculture activities, which uses this nutrient budget model based on the cultured species production summarized in the Fishery Statistic Yearbook of China during the past few decades of each species. And based on this model, we are able to know different forms of nitrogen and phosphorus released from each species, and we aggregate it at a yearly step. So for the atmospheric deposition, we coupled another model, another two models we just introduced. So now, in order to know the river export, we firstly need to how much of nutrients goes into the rivers. That means how much nutrient goes into the inland water system. We take nitrogen here as an example to introduce how we simulate and how the result is presented as the input to inland waters, so that we can also understand where this nutrient actually from, what kind of activities, as in natural or anthropogenic. So here we aggregate the river nitrogen delivery over the past few decades in the scale of river basins drainaging into different large marine ecosystem. For the rivers drain into the Yellow Sea and Bohai Sea system, we noticed that the blue one, actually the agriculture input dominate the whole input, followed by the sewage, which is the orange one, especially in recent years, and then by the aquaculture activities, and then followed by the natural inputs. And the composition of East China Sea is very similar to the nutrient composition to Yellow Sea and Bohai Sea. And but for the South China Sea, we noticed that the green ones is the natural inputs actually also constitute a very large fraction, especially in early decades. And for all these three regions, the river nitrogen delivery all showed a steadily increasing trend, and but the increase slowed down a little bit after the mid 1990s, and the human contributions, which is the sum of agriculture, wastewater, and aquaculture, dominant all these systems. And we noticed the rapid increase of sewage and aquaculture, especially in recent years. So, but we further want to know where are these inputs to the rivers come from. So we go back into the map of the yellow area, which is Chinese mainland, and also the green area, which is other countries. And we find out that for the rivers, the river nitrogen delivery to the Yellow Sea, Bohai Sea, and the East China Sea, the Chinese rivers dominant. But for the South China Sea, we have a feeling that actually the river nitrogen delivery in China and other countries are almost equal. But we also know the fact that the nutrient inputs goes into the rivers, which is a river nitrogen delivery, is not equal to the river export to seas, because a large amount of nutrients is actually returned in the river basins. So this is because of in-stream nutrient retention. What we want to know is how much nutrient is exported from rivers to the coastal system, so that we can solve other problems. So we compared of the river nitrogen export with the river nitrogen delivery at the same scale, and we find out that the temporal patterns of river nitrogen export is almost the same as river nitrogen input, but we found out that a larger part of nitrogen is actually returned in the inland water system. For example, in the river basins drain into the Yellow Sea, about 1/3 of nitrogen input is returned in these river basins. And for the river basins draining into the East Tennessee, about half of them is returned. And for the river basin drain to South Tennessee, about 1/4 of them is returned. And so they differ a lot among different systems. And we noticed that compared with the river input to river, the nitrogen input to rivers and the nitrogen export from rivers, the fraction of the orange and the reddish one, this is mainly point sources of sewage inputs, actually is larger in export than input. This is because the the population centers and the wastewater discharge positions is mainly in the downstream sections, and more of it is thus exported by rivers and less influenced by upstream upstream retention processes. And similarly, we want to know where are the river nitrogen export to the seas come from. So we noticed that it shows very similar patterns as the nitrogen inputs to the basins, and for the rivers draining to the Yellow Sea and Bohai Sea and East China Sea, the Chinese River are dominant, and also decide the entire river export increasing patterns. But for the river export to the South China Sea, the rivers from Chinese and other countries area are almost the same. So this movie actually shows the evolutionary river nitrogen export to this Yellow Sea, Bohai Sea large marine ecosystem during the past 4 decades. We can the pie sizes really actually match the loading numbers consistently, not only for the 3 but also for the other large marine ecosystem in the following 2 pages. We can tell that the sizes really increase a lot, which means the loading from river export increase a lot. And we can tell that the blue part, which is the agriculture, which is the river export originally from agriculture systems, increase a lot, is dominant, but it's not increasing. So the fraction increases from orange and red, which is sewage and aquaculture inputs. And for the following one is similar river natural export to East China Sea system during the past few decades, and it shows very similar patterns as the system of Yellow Sea and Bohai Sea, which is dominant by agriculture and also with increasing sewage and aquaculture inputs. But it's very different, as we just described, for the system of South China Sea, which in the very beginning dominated by the green natural inputs. And in the very beginning, the Chinese river contribution is even smaller than the contribution from other countries, but they become almost the same in the recent decades. And also the human impacts increased a lot in the recent decades, which is because not only the land use changes, also because of the increasing wastewater discharge and aquaculture activities. Okay, here comes the other source of, other source, I'm sorry, there's a small mistake. This circle should be here in the submarine fresh groundwater discharge, which also simulated by the image GM. So we also aggregate into the 3 systems of Yellow Sea and Bohai Sea, and the East China Sea and South China Sea, this 3 large marine ecosystem. We find that the scale of this contribution from submarine fresh groundwater discharge is much smaller than river export, and except for the increasing trend of submarine fresh groundwater discharge of nitrogen to South China Sea showing an increasing trend, the submarine fresh groundwater discharge of nitrogen to other systems almost maintain steady. And all these three systems, the contributions from China and other countries are almost equal. Oh, this is this one actually should be the mariculture released to the seas. The nitrogen release from mariculture in the coastal areas of the three large marine ecosystems all shows an increasing trend, especially after 1990s. The increases have been much more rapid, and we also noticed that about 70 to 90% of them are from the mariculture activities in China, which is of course because currently over 60% of global mariculture production is concentrated from China. So for the nitrogen from atmospheric deposition to the seas, they all show the increasing trend. And the largest is the atmospheric deposition to the South China Sea system, followed by the East China Sea and the Yellow and Bohai Sea. And this is not only related to the atmospheric nitrogen concentration, but also related to the entire sea area. For example, the South China Sea has a very large sea area, so which is reasonable why its atmospheric nitrogen deposition is relatively larger. So after we address all these individual sources, we want to know the total external input to the seas. We want to know how this changes during the past few decades. And when we summarize them in the following figures, we can tell that in all these three systems, the total external input of nitrogen showing an increasing trend, and the blue part, which is river export, dominant all this total nitrogen input to the seas, which is followed by the atmospheric deposition as the second largest. And for the Yellow Sea, Bohai Sea, and the East China Sea system, about 1/5 of atmospheric deposition is about 1/5 of river export. But for South China Sea, it's about half or 1/3 of river export, which means the contribution from atmospheric deposition is also important, as is proposed by some observation-based studies. And we also find that the mariculture in recent years also become increasingly important since the mid-1990s, and exceeding the contribution of a submarine fresh groundwater discharge, which is very small. And the movies following also shows the increase of the total flux and the change of the fractions of different sources. But we all know, as we introduced just earlier, that these problems of eutrophication and ecological disasters are mainly concentrated in the coastal area, as is introduced by the eutrophication status, seawater quality status, which is poor, and also the increasing red tide outbreaks in the coastal area, which are mainly concentrated in the coastal area. So we want to know how much nutrients are input to these coastal areas of the three systems. We further address this by calculating the external nutrient inputs to the area of 50 kilometers outside the coastline. So we now have the temporal changes and the spatial patterns of the nitrogen inputs to this belt coastal zone. From these changes, we can tell that the total inputs, which is shown by the size of these pie figures, the total nitrogen inputs increase a lot with the river export dominated. And we noticed that compared with the river export to the entire sea, its contribution to the coastal area is larger, and but the contribution from atmospheric deposition is smaller, and mariculture largely increased and become increasingly important in coastal area. And this spatial distributions also show the total increase of the total external nitrogen inputs to this coastal area, and the increase of the individual sources, as we can tell for the river export, which is mainly concentrated in the large estuaries of large rivers, and for the atmospheric deposition, which shows less spatial distribution, but also showing an increasing trend for the SFGD, which also increase. But for the mariculture, also quickly increased from insignificant to relatively important locally. So similarly, for nitrogen inputs, we also calculate the phosphorus input, and we find that the total phosphorus input also increased to the coastal areas of the three systems, and with river export dominant, and the mariculture's contribution largely increased when we compare the condition for 2010 and the condition for 1970. And we also found that the mariculture release of phosphorus even exceed the contribution from atmospheric deposition of phosphorus in 2010. We now observe both similar increase of the input for nitrogen and phosphorus by calculating their sources in a consistent way. We want to know how much are the molar ratios in the inputs to the coastal areas, because a lot of studies show that the NP ratios in the coastal waters will largely influence the development of harmful algal blooms, which usually the higher NP ratios can induce the development of more toxic harmful algal blooms of this species, and how these molar NP ratios in inputs change over the past few decades. So with this research question, we calculate the NP ratios in the inputs to this coastal area of the three large marine ecosystems. We found that the NP ratios from 1970 to 1990 increased in all the three coastal areas, and maintained a high level after 1990 until 2010, showing a very slight decreasing trend. But during all this period, they are all much higher than the Redfield ratio of 16, which is usually used for understand the nutrient uptake by phytoplankton in aquatic system. So spatially, we do it similarly for the aggregated level and spatially. So we tell that during this 4 decades, the nitrogen inputs and phosphorus inputs all show obvious increase spatially, and spatially this cause also increase in the NP ratios between 1970 and 2010. So there is a very large spatial difference, but we can tell that in almost every area, the NP ratios in inputs to the coast increase a lot. So how this increase in the NP ratios in inputs are connected with the NP ratios changes in the coastal waters. So this is also validated by the observed NP ratios in coastal waters. We can tell that with this increase of NP ratios in inputs, we found that the ratio of DIN and the DIP in coastal waters also increased a lot between 1980s and 2000s, based on a lot of observation-based studies. And for example, we can tell very obvious increase of NP ratios in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, and also very commonly in the Bohai Sea. So we come to a very direct conclusion that this increasing unbalanced NP ratios in inputs is consistent with the increasing unbalanced NP ratios in the coastal waters. And this unbalanced NP ratio in coastal waters, as we just briefly described in many other studies, they are very related to the development of harmful algal blooms. So we further look into the temporal changes of these NP ratios in input to coastal waters, and the harmful algal blooms occurred in the coastal waters. We found that they both increased a lot between 1970 and 1990 and maintained high level after 2000. Could there be any possible relationship between the occurrence of harmful algal blooms and the nutrient inputs and their ratios of nitrogen and phosphorus? Because the nutrient inputs to the coastal water actually is a supply for the development and growth of algae. So by addressing their relationship, we find a very important threshold for the development of harmful algal blooms. We found that harmful algal blooms start to develop in these three systems with high occurrence frequency, with larger area, and with highly diverse species. When the NP ratios in input to this coastal area exceed the threshold of 25 for the system of Yellow Sea and Bohai Sea, and for the threshold of 30 for the system of East China Sea and the South China Sea. And this threshold seem to be very important. How will this influence our policy of water pollution control and solving coastal harmful algal blooms? So we want to know future nutrient inputs to the Chinese coastal waters, and maybe by knowing this nutrient inputs to coast, we may be able to have a very quick look at the future harmful algal bloom risk, and perhaps the effectiveness of a future nutrient policies under various scenarios. So when in order to solve this research question, we further look back into the nutrient inputs of nitrogen and phosphorus and their ratios. We want to predict, but we don't want to make it too complex. From this figure, we can tell that the blue part, which is river export, is dominant. And we find that the NP ratios in the river export is also similar to the NP ratios of the total external input to the coastal areas. We did it similarly for the other sources, which is not very similar, also because of their smaller contributions to the total external inputs. So we came to a feeling impression that not only the river export, not only dominant the source, but the NP ratios in river export is also similar to the NP ratio in the total external input. So we decided to use NP ratios in the inputs from river export to roughly predict the future NP ratios in the input to the coastal area. When we now we already have the threshold of NP ratios of inputs between 25 to 30, and we decide to use a river export to roughly represent the total external input, and we use the definition of shared socio-economic pathway to simulate the nitrogen and phosphorus input to aquatic system under different scenarios, following from SSP1 to SSP5 from most sustainable SSP1, the business as usual SSP2, which follow the policies of current world, and the regionally different SSP3, and the strongly unequal with the very large difference for different groups, SSP4, and the SSP5, the traditionally development scenario focus only on the economic growth, relying strongly on fossil fuels. So with these three basic rules and assumptions, we are able to simulate the future nutrient inputs to these coastal systems. So we understand the SSP2 is following the policies of the current world, which is very possible for the future of our current world. But the SSP1 is the most hopeful one because it's most sustainable scenario, which will cut down the future use of nutrients in different kind of human activities, like the fertilization. As we can tell from the figure in the middle, that the future nitrogen and phosphorus used in fertilization will decrease a lot, which cause a decrease of nitrogen and phosphorus in the river export as well. But we find that even in this scenario of a business as usual, SSP2, and in the scenario of sustainability, which is SSP1, even the future use of nutrients is cut down. Even the future river export of nutrients are reduced. The future molar NP ratios in river export is not reduced. We find that in the black line, which is SSP2, following the current world, the NP ratios in future river export maintained around 27 to 28, which is higher than our threshold of 25. And in the SSP1, which is most sustainable scenario, when the nutrient use are largely cut down, the NP ratio are still higher than the threshold of 30, which is not which cannot help us to solve the problems of harmful algal blooms. And in the left figures, we find that in other scenarios, for example, in the most traditional development scenario of SSP5, the NP ratio is even close to 39 in 2015. Which is much higher than our threshold of 30. So we have a conclusion that maybe harmful algal blooms in Chinese coastal waters may continue to persist in future because of this perturbed nutrient ratios. And to solve this, we need to balance the nutrient use for sufficient food to feed the populations with downstream consequences to achieve healthy coastal oceans. And the nutrient reducing policies need to consider not only cutting down the nutrient fluxes, but also consider balancing the nutrient ratios. So here comes the take-home message. That's the nitrogen and phosphorus inputs to inland water system will have already increased because of various human activities. Firstly, agriculture, and recently the wastewater and freshwater aquaculture. And the total nutrient inputs to the three large marine ecosystem and their coastal areas increased, with the river export dominant, and followed by the atmospheric deposition, which is also the same scale of river export. And recently, the contribution from mariculture increased a lot since the mid-1990s, and it become increasingly important, especially in the coastal areas. And the NP ratios in the inputs to the coastal areas increased a lot during 1970 to 1990s and stay high afterwards. And harmful algal blooms start to develop when the threshold of NP ratios are exceeded. And with these future predictions, we are very negative to have a feeling that harmful algal blooms in Chinese coastal area may continue to persist in future because of perturbed nutrient ratios. But we are also hopeful to solve them in a positive way if we can balance the nutrient use for sufficient food with the downstream consequences by considering not only cutting down the fluxes, but also balance the nutrient ratios. Okay, that's all my research for presentation today. Thank you very much.
Oh, Junjie, thank you so much for this such a very interesting talk. This is almost the first comprehensive review about nitrogen and the phosphate import and historically and prediction. That's wonderful. Although the conclusion is not that promising. I mean, as you said, most likely the eutrophication and algal situation will persist. That's the challenge ahead of us. So we still have a very strong headwind, but very nice talk. Okay, Hans Paul have a question. So if you have any question, go ahead, unmute yourself. Go ahead. Yeah, Hans, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Hey, that was a great talk. Really very nice synopsis of the nutrients. I'm just, I have like two questions. One really deals with how you got the river inputs. It looks like a lot of that is groundwater that then goes into the river. Is that right? Into the rivers?
Yeah, true.
So how does that, I think the real key here in terms of ultimately pointing the finger at sources is how much is, like wastewater versus groundwater input itself.
Yeah, let me go back a little bit.
What do we need to target most aggressively here in terms of,
1 minute. And because I kind of do it very briefly for the modeling part. Actually, this model addressed the nutrient input by dividing them into diffusive sources and point sources. And so for the diffuse sources is actually from the soil. So with this image integrated assessment model, it first addressed the nutrient budget into the soil. That's mainly from depending on the system, which is maybe natural system, the land use, or this agricultural grassland. So the budget is different. And vertically, we have these 3 layers from when it penetrated into the shallow groundwater pathway within that grid cell and to the deep groundwater pathway. And and also some of them are transported where surface runoff. So with these 3 pathways, and after the one that is stored in the groundwater and stored in the soil, or that is transformed in the soil. The rest it goes into the surface water. This is the diffusive sources, and for the others, this include the direct source of atmospheric deposition, which is directly over the surface water, and also the sources of wastewater treatment, wastewater discharge, which is because of the sewage system directly connected to the river basin. And a freshwater aquaculture, which is also connected to the surface water. So this is of them. And for the one you just mentioned, the soil, the agriculture part, for example, because we have this vertical pathways which are different. The first one from surface runoff, the second and third one from groundwater of shallow and deep layer. So we when we try to summarize them, we I just present it into the surface runoff from groundwater and from agriculture and groundwater transport from agriculture.
Yeah, no, I understand, and you explained that very well. So in terms of the groundwater issue, that could be a really big challenge because we don't know how long that groundwater nitrogen has been sitting there, right?
It's indeed very a quite challenging part. So a good thing is that with this very explicit process-based model, we address this process very explicitly. We don't do the calibration or regression things, and instead of validating it directly for groundwater, we did some validations for river, the nutrient contents in rivers. So we assume that if we are very successfully simulate the nutrient concentrations in different positions of rivers, then that means the nutrient inputs goes to the river must be also correct to some extent. So especially when the time series and the spatial difference are well simulated, we assume it kind of correct.
Yeah, no, I understand. I have a quick second question. Have you looked at chlorophyll, the relationship of nitrogen loading and NDP to chlorophyll? Because it could be that what you're really seeing is eutrophication, so that also means that the chances for HABs would go up along with that.
Is it possible to change a little bit of the one I'm sharing this?
Well, that's okay. It's okay.
Yes,
you can
yes,
just tell me whether. Oh, okay, good.
Yeah, because actually, this presentation is about my two of my published papers. So in the supporting information, I not only present the NP ratios in the input. This is the NP ratio. This is the nutrient inputs directly to the harmful algal blooms of frequency and area. And the one following is the nutrient inputs with the curve A, which is related to the primary production. And the data of curve A is from the remote sensing data.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. It's not totally consistent with harmful algal blooms, which because I would consider them as totally two different groups. Not totally different groups, because harmful algal blooms is quite related to the imbalance of nutrients when they are excessive in the waters, as is found by this study. But for the curve A, we found that they are not always increasing with the nutrient inputs, as is found by this correlation relationship, especially in the middle of in the middle term. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I don't want to take up all the question time. Thank you.
Thank you.
So anybody, any other questions? So Junjie, I have a quick question. In the later part of your talk, you compared 1970 to 2010. I mean, the nitrogen and phosphorus import, the slide with the bar. So I have a question regarding the northern, the Bahai Sea, Yellow Sea area. So
you mean this?
This one. So if you think about the river discharge, and
about the river discharge. So if I understand right, you want to know if we are able to simulate the river discharge well, or
no. It's because in the Bahai Sea area, the Yellow River compared 1970, the water discharge reduced also 90%. It's only a minimum river discharge, other river like Liuhe, other surrounding river also almost dry up. So how come, it's still 3 times more than 1970 river discharge? If this is the true, even with a very low water flow, river flow, but still have a very high amount of nutrient export. Is that right?
I will answer this question from 3 points. Firstly, this comparison is the condition of 2010 to 1970.
Yes.
From this study, I would consider the 1970s relatively very less influenced by human activity. That is the input from humans in that period. But in 2010, it's much influenced.
Yes.
So maybe as you just introduced, in 2010, it's not as high as maybe 2000, but it doesn't mean that it's not higher than the early relative natural conditions in 1970s. This is first point. Second point is because this model is actually global scale model, and the resolution is also a little bit coarse if we look at the specific river. But a good thing is that it includes not one river. Like the Yellow River is very largely interrupted by human activities of dams, reservoirs, and water use for irrigation. So we include more, maybe the nutrient increase in other rivers. But indeed, the water discharge for the Yellow River because of the dry period is not so well simulated by the hydrology model, because the water used for irrigation is actually a little bit lacking in that hydrology model. But a good thing is that another colleague is working on fixing this model.
Okay.
So in the very future, it will be solved. But currently, we consider it almost it's very clear, close to the real state.
Okay.
And yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I see. Luwen. Luwen, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Junjie, and I use Luwen's computer.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, fantastic talk. I have 4 small questions. The first one is I see the time scale you look at from 1970 to 2010. I was wondering, have you or do you have plan to also look at more recent years? Because especially during the past 2 years, the algae bloom in East China Sea is very large area was reported in news.
Because this actually the work I'm presenting is the work I done in 2018 to 2019. It's also published in 2019 or to 2020. So it's early work, but now the new hydrology and output and the model are already updated to the real station of to the real condition of 2014. And for the future, until the recent years, we use the business as usual scenarios to roughly have an impression of the current year. So in SSP2, we are able to know what happens in the in more recent years, like 2019 or 2020. This is also possible. So the current situation is that we do have an update of the recent data. And the second one is that you mentioned the recent severe eutrophication related problem in the coastal area. Do you mean the problems in the Yangtze estuary or other area, or which area do you mean, or in the Changjiang estuary, do you mean?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. For this is a nutrient loading model I'm working. For the more process-based mechanism of coastal harmful algal blooms, especially in the Chinese seas. Another colleague of mine is developing and applying models to simulate how these nutrient inputs and other environmental factors like temperature, light conditions, sediment loading changes, and also the current system changes will influence the development of harmful algal blooms. And but it is a very seasonal event, because it mainly happens in the spring and summer seasons. And after that, it dies very fast. And also we have the seasonal hypoxia in the Junjie estuary, which is also seasonal. And these two problems, these two challenges, I think my colleagues with his coastal model may be hopeful to solve that, because this model for the nutrient fluxes is currently with a time step of 1 year. I'm also working on the nutrient inputs with a more smaller scale of time step and more specific forms of nutrient and their mechanisms, which is called image DGM, and also published already by my colleagues in 2020. So I'm continue to developing it. So in the future, we may be able to also solve these problems of nutrient inputs.
Excellent, thank you so much. And my follow-up question is about the scenario. I noticed you presented 5 scenarios. It seems SSP1, which is sustainable development scenarios.
Yeah.
Notice the nitrogen phosphorus ratio kind of higher than most of others. I was wondering
why this happened?
Just curious, yeah.
Yeah, because this is actually as just Paul just mentioned, it seems very negative, but we also see see a large hope here, because we know why it happens. When we know why, we are able to solve it, because current policies are only considering cutting down the fluxes by, for example, this amount, this quantity of nitrogen, this quantity of phosphorus, and they don't consider it in a systematic way in the very original way of the nutrient use of NP ratios. If they consider in their future policies, then maybe these problems can be better solved. So this also in the other aspect means hope to solve this problem.
Okay, thank you. I can wait, so in case others have questions. If not, I can ask another.
Okay, cool. So where you got from? I'm wondering. Are you from Hangzhou, Xiamen, or Guangzhou? Luwen?
We are currently PhD student in Michigan State University, so country in US.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool. Okay, thank you. So, any other question?
You can also send me email, and I will answer when I receive it. Yeah.
Okay. So Junjie, another quick question. In one of the chart, you show atmosphere deposition import up to 10 to 15 of the river discharge. This number is pretty big. I mean, this ratio to me. Is this also, how about this number compare other marginal sea area?
Other marginal sea, you mean other regions in the globe?
Yeah, for example, the North Sea, for example, the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, I guess Chinese marginal sea received much more dust, atmosphere import, right?
Yeah, it's true. And as I just briefly described, it's not only decided by the atmospheric nitrogen concentration, but also decided by the sea area. So imagine the sea area is very small. Maybe its total flux of atmospheric deposition nitrogen input can be smaller, but also we understand if it's further away from the land, it receives less nitrogen input, and so it's decided actually by these two factors if we look at in a direct way. But for more in-depth reason is also related to the atmospheric model, which consider the reactive nitrogen cycle to the entire atmosphere. Yeah. So I didn't. Yeah. So I didn't. So it depends also on the nitrogen emissions to the atmosphere and how they are deposited to the everywhere, every region, and how they are transported in the atmosphere, and they are finally deposited to over the sea. So that's described in the papers about these two models. But we understand. I haven't done the comparison for other regions, but for the Chinese river, for the Chinese seas, they are indeed important, and this is also proposed by some measurement-based studies. But it's quite difficult because measurement cannot be done everywhere over the for the atmospheric deposition, especially from the sea. So very common, they use very limited measurement in the sea, and for the contribution from atmospheric deposition to represent the state for a whole period. So that's quite uncertain.
There's some study collect some. Yeah, that's interesting. In the world, there's at least two locations, the western coast of Africa, Sahara Desert, a huge amount, and also the western coast of Australia. But China Modern Sea also should be very high. Okay, cool. Anybody else? I think your talk carry a lot of information. It's very good, informative, very nice. And anybody else now is already here in US 10:07 a.m. If no any other question, thank you so much, and for the wonderful contribution, wonderful talk, Junjie, and appreciate.
Thank you.
Okay.
And thank you for giving me the chance to present my research. And if anybody is interested, please don't hesitate to contact me with the email address, which is on the first page of this presentation.
Sure. Sounds very good. Sounds very good. Okay. Luwen reported the a question here. Did you look at the spatial source of nitrogen phosphate? For example, which province contribute most to the coastal problem?
Did you look at the spatial source of nitrogen? Yes. We do not only look at the spatial source in provincial scale. We actually simulate it with a spatial resolution of half degree. So we know for every degree, half degree gray cell, we know how much nutrient, like for example, nitrogen, are input into them, and for this amount of input, we know how much of them is from this source, like agriculture, how much of them is from aquaculture, from sewage input. So it's much more actually explicit than the provincial scale, which is also advanced of this study.
And we also see Jiangsu province should be blamed for the Hutai, that.
I think that remains controversial, right?
Yeah, just anyway, that's more work you need to do and have a high resolution. That was very interesting. Yeah. Okay, thank you everybody here, and so I'll see you next week. So next week is Bina Shuang from Ocean University come here talk about the dam regulation on the Yellow River drop sediment to the sea. Okay, okay, see you next